Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war with our Russian subject matter expert, Dr. Yuval Weber. I will take a moment here to do a quick shout out to my fellow Marines and everyone out there in the Team Krulak community who celebrates the Marine Corps birthday. This is the one day I told Yuval this is where we have our fancy hats and our fancy pants, and where it's the one day we would have an excuse to be super obnoxious to everybody else. We do that more than one day out of the year, but this year or this day is the day there that it's socially acceptable. So happy birthday to all the Marines out there. And we going back to the subject matter in hand, though, there have been some pretty big sea changes in what's been going on over in Ukraine it was interesting because after the last episode, it was a couple of days later, it was a pretty big high profile event that happened in the Black Sea or against the Russian Black Sea fleet right after the last episode. And then right before this one, we had some other fairly big news coming out of really coming out of Russia, and then sort of Ukraine is watching to see if it's true, but developments in the Kherson region, which we've been watching for a while. So I think we're going to start with what happened a couple days after the last episode to the Black Sea fleet, which just cannot seem to catch a break. So Yuval, if you welcome again, and if you want to sort of queue up what that event was against the Black Sea Fleet last week.
So again, first of all, happy birthday to the Marines. In basically the Russian version of the happy birthday song, one of the key lines is, it's a shame or a tragedy that a birthday happens only once a year. So to find the gruesomeness of the birthday. But I'd like to ask you, given that we saw a major drone attack on the Black Sea Fleet, what are the first two lines of the Marine Corps song?
As it happens, the opening line of the Marine Corps hymn goes, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." And to those who are not familiar with Marine Corps history, you might be wondering why is that line in there? So I'm going to go on a little bit of a historical discursion here, but it's going to come back to what we just saw, the attack that Ukraine conducted using unmanned naval drones, surface water drones, against some of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet while they were at anchor. So, and this kind of ties back to what's new about this, if anything. If not, what are the implications here in 21st century warfare if it's not anything? But shores of Tripoli, reference back to the Barbary Wars, which were a series of U.S. naval and ultimately land-ground Marine Corps employments against sort of the loose affiliation of states that were collected under the banner of the Barbary states. This is looking back at some of the Arab nations on North Africa at the time, and these nations conducted sort of commerce raiding, hostage taking, and ransom notes, if you will, against merchant ships that travel through the Mediterranean Sea off the coastline of North Africa. It was a problem for a long, long time. And so looking at Thomas Jefferson's first term as president of the United States, so where this is, very early 1800s here, European nations had they'd done one of two things to deal with the Barbary pirates. Either they simply paid them off, came into an arrangement where, paying the ransom was easier than having to go and get the ships and their sailors and their cargo back. So they either pay them off, or they would send their own naval units down to patrol those waters and protect their ships as escorts if they had the military might to do so. The United States at this point didn't have the naval capacity to do that at all. So they were basically defenseless. Their U.S. merchant ships are basically defenseless against the predations of the Barbary pirates. And finally got to the point where, Jefferson and his cabinet were like, we're not going to do this anymore. And short version is, there were a series of U.S. Navy squadron deployments over the course of a few years. Each squadron that was sent was a little bit more capable and was able to cause more effects against the Barbary pirates. And while this was going on, Jefferson's cabinet was in negotiation with the brother of the Pasha, or the Bey of Tripoli, which is sort of the leading Barbary state in this, saying, if we'll help you out, we'll knock your brother off the throne, we'll give you some military support if you promise that when you're on the throne, you won't raid our ships anymore. And this turned into the Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and his small contingent of Marines and a Bedouin Arab force under this brother, and they marched their way to Derna, which is it's a little bit east of Tripoli, if we're looking at the map here. And that's where the Shores of Tripoli piece comes from. That was, that's the first time that the Stars and Stripes was raised over the old world. And as it turned out, the Pasha of Tripoli saw the writing on the wall and negotiated an end to, an end to his raiding of the American things. The brother did not wind up sitting on the throne. A little bit anticlimactic, but within these naval squadron deployments, on the third deployment, under Commodore Preble, I believe it was, U.S. Navy Commodore Preble, he was one of the most aggressive, U.S. Navy squadron commander up to that point. The other two had been either ineffective. I think one was actually relieved for being incompetent or drunk a lot of the time, or both. But like Preble was like I'm going to go get him. And so there was very aggressive pursuit, a number of operations directly against the pirate ships that were in the harbor of Tripoli. One of those attempted operations was what would have been called a fire ship back then, which was a vessel or a raft that was basically loaded with incendiaries and explosives, and you would sail it into the enemy harbor where the enemy's fleet was at anchor and light it up. And the plan was it would come up against a ship and light it on fire, or if you had enough explosives, you get a big boom and you could cause some serious damage to the fleet. And so the plan was to sail one called the USS Intrepid, which was a converted ketch, very small vessel. But it's going to be loaded with explosives. It would have a time fuse. The sailors would sail it up to a certain point, get off the Intrepid. It would continue on its merry way into the harbor, and then it would go boom and destroy, hopefully most, maybe all of the Tripolitanian fleet at anchor. As it happened, it didn't go as planned. The explosion detonated prematurely. The sailors were not able to get off, and so they were killed in the explosion. Nobody's really sure why. Possible that they were taken under fire early, and that they sort of lit it to make it explode. While they had a chance. But the bottom line is, sailing incendiaries and explosives into a harbor to attack a fleet at anchor, not a new thing. I'm not sure how back far historically it goes, but it's centuries old, at least, if not millennia old. So in what the Ukrainians recently attempted against the Black Sea Fleet, not necessarily a new thing, but maybe an old thing conducted in a new way that has some implications that, raises a lot of implications. One, I think it's a continued highlighting of the, vulnerability implies maybe, a certain lack of oversight on one thing. Not convinced that it's just a lack of competence on the Russian Navy side in terms of harbor security, right? Like they've lost their flagship already. They know that Crimea is not really safe territory because there have been multiple attacks and strikes in there, against airfield and other targets. They've moved the Black Sea Fleet farther and farther away. But even at that distance, there were not enough harbor security measures for that fleet at anchor to, protect it from this attack that had to have been launched from a fairly long range. I know there's not a lot of details that came out about it, but there was some speculation that given, the Black Sea is large, right? You would have to transit those drones pretty far from safe Ukrainian territory to do this. So there was some speculation that maybe some sort of, team or surface flotilla had sailed to a certain point in the Black Sea, and then they launched the drones from there and guided them in the rest of the way within the range of the sail. I think that part is still kind of unclear, but the point is, it's harder to, like, Russia, the Black Fleet is running out of safe havens. And if they value having that fleet as a capability, I don't care how far away you are, there's basic security measures you take, and Ukrainian drones just sailed on past it. And I think also as well, the amount of damage, I think it was the Admiral Makarov was potentially the primary target. It's unclear if it got hit or if it did, how much damage there was. And there was also discussion of a minesweeper might have been, possibly hit and damaged in the attack. But one, again, the point is, whether it's a combination of incompetence or, really good Ukrainian tactics or some combination of both, the Black Sea Fleet is still vulnerable, no matter how far they've moved it away from Ukrainian territory near the Black Sea, which is said some things about sort of Russian capability overall. Two, the big things that Ukraine seems to do are tied into their information campaign, or their information campaign is tied into them. And so it was remarkable. Like I remember seeing on social media, they were the first couple of postings like, hey, something just happened in the Black Sea Fleet. And then like within hours, we had the video, right, from the Ukrainian side about it. And we were talking before we recorded, right? Some of it is pretty dramatic, like Hollywood type stuff of you got the drone, the bow, and you can sort of see there's there's spray going on, there's warship in the background. And then this Russian helicopter comes in, guns blazing. You got spouts of water popping up where the rounds are hitting in the water. This drone is just sailing on to its target, but the tying these, these high impact attacks against Russian high value targets and then tying the information campaign into it, very, very tightly is just another indication of what information potentially gets you on a modern battlefield. And I think it goes back to something that we have hit before a number of times is, part of what Ukraine needs to do to keep the spigot of support on is demonstrating that they can use the things that they're given effectively, right? Well, I mean, doing a long range surface drone strike on Russian capital ships when they still don't have a navy means like the few things, the bits and pieces they had to put that together, it's more, there's proof in the camera, proof in the video of their ability to do, some pretty remarkable things with limited resources. So, hey, if they can do that with limited resources, keep the spigot going, and maybe they'll get more, be able to do more, either more dramatic or more tactically impactful things. And then the third point, and for us on the U.S. or allied side as the observers is, it raises some questions and concerns about what you do for your own harbor security when unmanned drones are now in the game, right? And again, it's not a new tactic. Unmanned technology is obviously not new technology either. But it highlights again that ships at anchor are inherently more vulnerable than ships underway. And the difference between, we were talking about this as well before, right? Between a manned suicide attack on something like the USS Cole versus a unmanned drone attack is those devices, the unmanned devices, have a lower profile, right? Harder to detect than a boat that's got a bunch of dudes on it coming at you. It's a much more challenging problem to have to defend against. And, I'm trying to think the last time like a U.S. fleet at anchor was attacked outside of Pearl Harbor.
It wasn't the USS Cole?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The USS Cole. I just said it. But we saw like we're at a ship at anchor is inherently vulnerable, and the technology is not hard to get, right? Like to build probably build a military grade and stack a bunch of explosives on it. That's going to take a little bit of doing, but to make a radio controlled boat, for example, like that's not hard. None of these things are hard to get or put together. And are we ready? Is the U.S. ready in its own harbors, or if the U.S. is, deployed overseas? We've obviously stepped up our security procedures after the USS Cole, in harbor close to territories that could be, unfriendly or potentially home to non-state or violent extremist actors. So are we ready for that type of attack against us? Are our allies and partners ready for that type of attack against them? Because, if we go to one of their harbors, we're offering a big juicy target to somebody who's close by. I'm not, I wouldn't say that we're going to start seeing attacks at home, right? But our ships are expeditionary; they deploy all over the world, and the world just got a lesson in a military without a navy can still cause effects against somebody else's navy. U.S. Navy is big. There are lots of other countries out there and non-state actors that either have very small navies or don't have navies at all. But they just got a little bit of inspiration of the art of the possible. Are we ready, to defend against that kind of thing?
So I think that's great. So basically, putting it all together, the Ukrainians leveraged an old tactic with new technologies, but tied it into, to dare is to do. And having done something that is by itself dramatic goes into an ongoing information narrative that the Ukrainians have, which is we're doing extraordinary things with the limited amount of support that we're getting. So the more support that we can get, the more stuff that we can do. And the sooner we can bring this war to an end from a position that is sustainable, at least for us, i.e., the Ukrainian side. And the consequences thereof is what does that do for Russia? This is not the first time the Ukrainians have done something dramatic. We've talked about attacks on the big Crimean bridge. We've talked about attacks on airfields in Crimea. We've had all of these different things, and at each point, the Black Sea flagship being sunk um, again by a country that doesn't have a navy. So when we talk about all of these things, Ukraine is able to say two things within the information narrative. We're doing well with what we have. What would happen if we had more? And two, the Russians aren't able to basically keep up their end of basically fighting this war. So both in terms of demand and supply, the Ukrainians are doing better. And they're pointing to the Russians being unable to fight better. And that inability on the Russian side to fight better then essentially creates both obviously like anger on the Russian side, but then they have to reset from a position of relative weakness relative to what happened before the attack. And right after this attack, this drone attack against their minesweeper, they moved a number of their ships further east to like Novorossiysk and other places along Russia's southern borders, southern naval borders, further out of harm's way relative to Crimea. And that's the thing of what Crimea is able to then do in order to maintain the momentum of their fighting conflict. So we had basically the big drone attack. Russians get embarrassed one more time. And again, for those who haven't yet seen it, I was trying to remember the movie Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen from 1990. There's a very dramatic moment, as you put it, in which basically the boat is moving towards, the target, and the bullets are flying all around. There's a very similar scene in the movie Navy SEALs in which Charlie Sheen, again in his prime, in his pump, with the Navy SEALs to go attack the enemy ship, and the bullets going through the water has a similar sort of really dramatic effect. So what we saw after this is basically in the very next news cycle, Vladimir Putin says because the Ukrainians have attacked a ship which was guaranteeing the safety of the grain deal and the shipping lanes from Ukraine, to Turkey and to the outside world, that because Ukraine has attacked a ship that was protecting those lanes, that Russia is exiting from that grain deal, that i.e. that would basically grain from Ukraine going to the larger global south. The immediate fear across the world was, this grain is critical to ensuring that global hunger does not create crisis situations, North Africa, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. The Turks, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, then said, no, this grain deal is ongoing, and he ensured that Turkish ships were going to accompany Iranian ships taking them out. Putin said that, there's no more guaranteed safety for Erdogan. The safety is borne by my name and by the Turkish flag. And Putin had to stand down less than 48 hours later. And the ship, and basically Erdogan said to the Ukrainians, publicly signaling, you can continue to load the ships, you can continue to sail the ships. The Russians will have to fire upon us in order for these ships to not go out. And then within roughly 2 days, Putin came back to the deal, saying that their concerns had been addressed and that they will continue to enforce the deal to allow the grain to leave Ukraine. So we can see in terms of, what are the strategic effects of successful tactics and successful operations, is they reshape the parameters of what President Putin, what Erdogan, what Zelensky, what everyone is able to do, because what these attacks reveal is relative strength and relative weakness. And the weaker that Russia gets, the more emboldened Erdogan becomes in terms of asserting the greater control of not just what happens to and from the Black Sea through the Bosphorus Straits, but also what happens inside the Black Sea. And this is probably a level of Turkish, let's say, power and influence that has not been realized since maybe the 19th century, when the Russians were coming in under, like, in from Catherine the Great's time, in the 18th century onwards, when Russia exporting early its influence south. This might be the highest level of Turkish influence since those days. And that's in essence drone attack, grain deal, and Russia's just a bit weaker thereafter.
Yeah, and it's just been kind of remarkable to watch the sort of in real time the continued, you know, diminishment of Putin's ability to throw his weight around. And it kind of reminds me of several weeks back there was that the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, maybe if I'm getting the name
Yeah.
close to right, when all the other, not world leaders, not regional leaders, just like local nation leaders of countries that used to be part of the Russian Empire, making Putin wait, for them to come out and shake his hand rather than the other way around. Um, and this is just another data point that sort of gives the sense of there's, some countries are starting to smell the blood in the water, that that Putin and his forces and the threats that he's making, he is less and less capable of making those real. To the point where if you're Erdogan, you can just tell Putin, no, we're going to do what we want to do. You can't stop, behind the scenes. But the implication is we're going to keep doing what we want to do. You can't stop us. You're not going to stop us, and we know that you cannot call our bluff. So I kind of wonder, who's gonna be next to call Putin's bluff, because everybody smells it. They know that because of the commitments in Ukraine and the levels of loss and the economic disruption just for that one mission, he can't bite off anything else at this point.
That's a point to dwell upon as we then think, the other major news of the week and the month, of the abandonment of Kherson, is that the power of any leader, in effect, is the power to persuade, the power to convey life is better with me than without me, that I will be able to rule indefinitely, that my word is basically your actions. And in that regard, it's more acute in autocratic systems of appearances being reality. So we have, as you put in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, I guess last month, or time has lost all meaning to me at this point, but a couple weeks ago, let's put it, countries that ordinarily would, like a Russian leader would consider, like Kyrgyz Republic, to basically be a doormat of the basically Russian Empire. It shares a border to protect from China, sort of thing. The leader, small for a country as small as that, but also Erdogan directly, and this is coming up with these historical references, is that I cannot think, unless we really go to the days of basically pre-Catherine the Great, when was the last time a Turkish leader was able to embarrass Putin one-on-one and then say no to a policy imperative of the Russian president? We have to go back really to the days of the Ottomans, in which a leader of someone, in that area was defying a Russian leader. And that is basically, particularly in these autocratic systems, power sort of functions like the way a bank run functions. It's if everyone believes there's plenty of money, then that leader is very strong and secure. Once people start to test and challenge how much power does that leader actually have, then you have lots of others doing it, and then no one wants to be the last one left in terms of not getting their slice on the way out. And that to me is extraordinary relative to where, at the very beginning of this year, you had world leaders begging and pleading Putin, at the end of a very long table, not to invade Ukraine. And now you have world leaders essentially openly insulting the Russian president. That's what we're observing in real time. And that is, when we then think about the announcement yesterday. So today, obviously November 10th, happy birthday, Marines, once more. November 9th, the Russians announced that they are going to tactically withdraw to the left bank, the east bank of the Dnieper River, thereby abandoning their major gain, their major sort of political gain of the war so far, which was Kherson City, which was the only regional capital from Ukraine that they were able to capture over the course of this conflict. And they did it at the very beginning, not by armed conquest, but by turning sufficient numbers of local leaders in order to then just switch Kherson from Ukraine to Russia. What were your initial thoughts when you read this news or when you saw this news?
So one of the things that jumped out at me first was, and maybe you can explain this a little bit, but there seemed to be a sort of deliberate dramatic staging in how this news was delivered, because I think it was Shoigu and I forget who the other
Surovikin.
Surovikin. So like there's it's this deliberate, it's like this stage setup of, I'm here to make my recommendation, and then dramatic camera cut, right? I accept your recommendation and we will go out and do it. So it seemed to be very deliberately staged. I'm not sure if it had the dramatic impact, if it landed the way they wanted it to land, but it was definitely sort of set up to convey a message. But it was also noted that this is general talking to general for a withdrawal and surrender of what is supposed to be Russian territory, because they annexed it and it's supposed to be under the Russian nuclear umbrella. And generals don't make that decision on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody, that's political leadership decision. That's not a military decision. But the political leader was noticeably absent in that video. There was no Putin. There were just the two Russian generals. So that was kind of the first thing that jumped out at me. Did that strike you, and what are sort of the messages that we take from that?
So we have been talking about the crumbling Russian position around Kherson City, I think at this point for maybe 2 months, and even longer if we can sort of dial back. The success of the Kharkiv offensive in the northeast of Ukraine was in fact the surprise, the deception, because the Russians were anticipating that the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians kept talking about their Kherson offensive, we've been talking about that since summer. And in the summertime, we then observed that the Russians were putting more and more troops into the south of Russia because, again, Kherson is basically the area that defends, on the map, it defends the approach to Crimea. And Crimea, as we've said a number of times, it's not Russia's Jerusalem, but it's Putin's. This is really the only thing that can't happen for Putin, is to lose Crimea. So the Ukrainians leveraged that knowledge in order to draw Russian forces south to protect Kherson, obviously to protect Kherson. They had their successes in Kharkiv, and they've reconquered thousands, like tens of thousands or low tens of thousands of square kilometers of their own territory. So at this point, looking at the pre-war map, the current map, the Ukrainians have reconquered half of what they lost from February onwards. And basically, the Russians only have 2/3 of what they've taken since 2014. So again, thinking about what the future looks like. But in that regard, these are some of the best Russian soldiers that they have left. We know that at a larger point, this is just like a debacle. And one of the things that you mentioned a moment ago of there was this sort of like this, very clearly scripted scene in which like the general had been appointed, roughly speaking, a month or 6 weeks ago, already coming in talking about difficult decisions that need to be made. And it was clear that probably the only way that he took that position, that command, was in order to effect this particular withdrawal so that Russia could defend the left bank of the river much more easily than being marooned on the right side of the river with having their supply lines being interdicted on a daily basis. So he came in. The Russian media has pumped him up for a month, 6 weeks. This hero of Russia, this really tough-looking guy, and he makes the big announcement that the defense chief takes. Now, this chief of defense, this Chad, is not a person who's ever served in the military. but he makes it appear as if he has had a long and distinguished military career. And we start to think, as a political decision, I believe we have now identified for once and for all who's going to be the fall guy for the rest of this conflict. Because a fiasco of this size needs somebody to blame, and Putin is going to spend the rest of his days finding out who really let him down.
Yes, big mystery. I can't wait for the the dramatic third act for when they find who done it in this one.
Yes, clearly, Putin knew that the invasion of Ukraine was going to take 3 days, that the genocide was going to be seamless, and the revision of the international order just a natural consequence. But clearly, he was not being fed everything that needed to be fed to him. And so, in that regard, we can start to see, when you're talking about a political decision, someone has to be blamed for this. Someone has to be the face of the abandonment of Russian territory, which is something that only happens under dire circumstances. Like, we're talking 1941, the Germans are coming over the border. That's what we're talking about in terms of the invasion here. You can imagine, who do you think, Putin's obviously an important person, can meet with anyone he wants. The person that he was meeting with on basically the day yesterday was basically Russia's public health chief, sort of perhaps an equivalent that we can think of the
Like Surgeon General kind of thing.
sort of more like the sort of like a Surgeon General, like a Dr. Fauci type, like those sorts of things, which made me then sort of pause and just like think to myself, it's a bad news day when COVID is the better topic for you compared to literally whatever else is happening in your particular news cycle.
Yeah,
So,
and which is interesting because I think well, it's kind of a sidebar discussion, but uh, it's not at all clear that Russia handled COVID particularly well. So bringing that back to the spotlight is, as you said, it's the least bad decision of something or thing to talk about of something that's even worse. One thing I want to bring up as well is, in some of the other after that initial reaction, that staging video I saw, there were actually from Ukrainian media outlets, some of which was one of them from the advisor to President Zelensky himself, was sort of like noting caution, like, hey, they're saying this, but we haven't seen anything yet. And then, since the announcement, there's been some speculation as to whether this might actually be for whatever talent Russia has left for information operations, whether this is, something to try and entice the Ukrainians into attacking at a disadvantage when they don't actually intend to leave. So do we know enough yet to say whether, they're saying this to try and, do deception operations and get the Ukrainians to attack? Are they maybe going to hold on to Kherson city itself and withdraw other forces? Or do we just not know enough yet to know what the development will actually be in terms of removal of Russian forces?
so sure. So anything is possible. We know, just by sort of looking at the map, is that I think it was estimated at its height there were 40,000 Russian troops, mercenaries, mobilized, reservists, etc., plus civilian occupation officials. And just on civilian occupation officials, the Russian appointed head of the local occupation administration also died this week. So he died in a road accident. Whether it was just driving dangerously, or basically just removing one loose cannon versus several others, unknown. But basically, even Russia couldn't protect the life of its main quisling there. What we can see in terms of what let's call it a tactical withdrawal for a second here, is that on a political level, on an information level, this is a humiliation. One person pointed out on Twitter that supporting the withdrawal, supporting Russian action of like the army leaving Kherson city to go to like the other bank of the river, where they have prepared defensive fortifications for the last couple of weeks. It'll be easier to defend. We can talk about the military aspects of that in just a moment. But if you support this, you are technically speaking in violation of Russian law because you are calling into question the totality of Russia's territorial integrity. However, if you oppose the tactical withdrawal, then you are calling into question the Russian armed forces and publicly discrediting them. So both supporting and not supporting are both violations of Russian law.
Yes, and when you described that before we started, it echoed back what we titled the last episode and the quote that you gave, which is, "You do not understand Russia with the mind." I just don't like what do they think the people, the Russian populace is going to make of that messaging? Like, what effect are they just hoping nobody talks about it? Right? If I talk about it one way or the other way, I'm in trouble the other way. So I just want to talk about it because all talk about it is illegal. Is that sort of the ultimate end state for this little sort of exercise in doublethink?
Oh, oh no, my sweet summer child. If you so this is the messaging that would have been familiar to if we were in basically the era of World War I, 1917, 1918. Lenin has just given up all the Western Russian lands to like the German, the Austrians, to focus on the revolution at home. What the Soviets always did, what the Bolsheviks, before and after, were always able to look at is everything is tactical and contingent. So on Russian television, you have people saying the abandonment of Kherson is actually a genius move because the defensibility of the lines on the other side of the Dnieper River will allow for a much more successful counterattack later in order to re-liberate Kherson. So everything will be revealed in the end. So even a humiliating loss, humiliation in front of the rest of the world, is just setting the stage for an even grander victory in short order. That's in essence the messaging strategy that when Russian TV viewers are trying to figure out how do we balance like a clear humiliation versus we're going to win in the end. This is the consequence of making, basically like tactical decisions that have strategic implications every single week when you're just trying to disrupt or win the news cycle. Is you find yourself in these contortions having to rely on basically conspiracy level thinking in order to find the way out of whatever the problem is. That's where the Russians are where they are right now. So in terms of like what's like the military logic, not having, let's say 40,000 of your best troops basically being encircled, kettled, and destroyed, which is basically then reducing whatever level of combat capability they'll have going forward. And just to note, one of the other bits that we had just today is General Milley said that the Russians have lost more than 100,000 killed and wounded in action. He said the same thing for the Ukrainians, but the casualties are rising for the Russians. We know that basically not just sacrificing the lives of the service members just because, sunk costs are sunk costs, means that the Russians are now in a position where they're trading land for time, ostensibly in order to train up the hundreds of thousands of citizens that they just mobilized into their militaries. We can sort of evaluate what is going to be the nature of this withdrawal, whether it's going to be pandemonium, whether it's going to be orderly, whether the Ukrainians, as you put it right before we started recording, referencing Sun Tzu, like the Golden Bridge, allowing these Russians to leave, or whether the Ukrainians want to go after these retreating soldiers in order to prevent not only them, attacking in the future, but also being redeployed to Donbass or Kharkiv or any other areas. At its core, the Russian state does not anymore have a very convincing narrative of how success is going to happen very quickly. What the Russians have been trying to do for the last number of months, once it became clear that the battlefield was not a friendly place for them, or not a place where they were going to get a lot of success, is they were trying to reduce the support for Ukraine from abroad that has been as you put it earlier, a spigot of success or spigot of materials that has led to Ukrainian success. And, it's worth mentioning, just to sort of leave it, just to put it out there, when the Russians do think about what is the true enemy, again, watching Soloviev last night, they talk about, Russia was unprepared for fighting against NATO. And they also discuss, in terms of foreign support for Ukraine, the Russians, and Soloviev said this, and I just need to introduce it in a very careful manner, is to say that it was clear that basically Kherson had to be abandoned for at least the last month. But they delayed it until yesterday so as the news of the abandonment would not have any impact on the US midterm elections, because they were hoping for the United States, like most of the countries supporting Ukraine, they're hoping for more war skeptical voices to come to power in different components so as to have a tougher look on the extent of the support to Ukraine. And if that was basically a goal of what they wanted out of the midterm results, then that's not happening. So what does success for Russia look going forward? That's again the sort of thing that they need to come up with bigger and brighter ideas, and the bigger and brighter ideas have the chance of just falling flat in more dramatic ways, and thus exacerbating the problems that we're observing on the Russian side.
Yeah, and again, something talking about before we recorded, it's the note about the election. It's a curious data point, but it also sort of ties back to our ongoing discussion of like Putin just seems to keep making bad miscalculations over and over and over again. And it's not to say that he was the only one who sort of didn't read the tea leaves right for the midterm elections. Obviously, the shape looked very different than a lot of punditry and some of the polling indicated. But the point is, if that was something he was banking on, he's been banking on all these things that he thought was going to happen since before the war started. Going back to thinking his intelligence operations were going to undermine Ukrainian support, leadership support, and he was going to waltz into Kyiv, and then just this long trail of broken assumptions and miscalculations. And this is just one more, right? He, separate question to whether the American people, whether we understand ourselves, but he thought he understood us. He was banking on that as part of his strategy for the winter, well, wrong again. And he's running out of weeks to be wrong and assumptions that can fail before he sort of hits a point of catastrophic failure that you can't recoup in another week. One thing we did not talk about this before, but I want to discuss it a little bit potentially with whatever sort of your thoughts on it is. Kherson, you mentioned that that it was taken not directly by military force, but an intelligence operation, and because I think there's a larger amount of either Russian speakers or Russian friendly people are in that area. But so I guess kind of knowing that there's a slightly different demographic that was in that region to start with. What do you think that if and when the withdrawal there is completed, what are we going to find that they've left behind? We already know there's going to be no laundry machines because they steal everything they can get their hands on. But do we think we're going to find a laundry machine less city, but otherwise largely unmolested, or are we potentially going to roll in and see another Bucha?
It's a great question. We know in the places where Russia faced resistance in their initial advances, whether it's like as grotesque as Bucha or as prolonged as it was in Mariupol, the Russians destroy everything, in a medieval sense, as a warning to the others. In Kherson, they wanted to make that basically the showpiece of the benefits of Russia. And so, in terms of the physical infrastructure, unless this gets to the question, did they basically booby trap and mine everything on the way out, basically acknowledging that they're never going to return? Or did they basically leave more or less the city intact because they do want to return? The condition of, and just to be clear, the Russians still have defensive positions around the city. They're protecting the withdrawal. And we've observed, there's many pontoon bridges and sort of like ferries going. Um, if they basically destroy Kherson on the way out so the Ukrainians can't have it, that says a lot more about basically the maximum extent of their war aims going forward. But if they basically more or less leave everything intact, then we know there's at least some basic political instruction: don't destroy this town because we are coming back. And to me, that's going to be a great test of what the Russians think they can actually do. Um, and again, there will be there will be sort of like bloody basement prisons in which the resistors like were tortured, executed, like left to rot. We're going to find that. Like that's because that's what the Russians do everywhere. And even within Kherson, like troops were, being like attacked on the street every so
Yeah,
often.
we know there's pretty clear there was partisan activity there, although
Yeah.
the scope and scale unclear, but we know that it was active.
And so that the two questions is, one, we're going to see just like violation of like human rights writ large. The extent of that is basically going to be the proxy of how difficult it was for Russia to govern. And two, whether Russia destroys Kherson on the way out, whether as they are leaving, whether they go and try to just break infrastructure a la Mariupol, just so the Ukrainians have more to rebuild, that the city becomes less inhabitable. That will that will indicate, I think, fairly directly what the Russians believe is possible for them in Ukraine.
An unpleasant calculation to think of uh, because there's going to be more places that are going to be probably liberated, and we'll talk about potentially other axes of advance here in just a second. Yeah, but I don't know what you hope for, that they leave it alone and just get out, or go scorched earth, and because the implications of both are, if they think there's a chance they're going to come back, that's more data showing that no matter the lack of success on the battlefield, Putin's going to keep trying, which means the war potentially continues for a longer time. On the flip side, if they just burn it all down, okay, maybe the war ends a little bit more quickly, but it's going to be it's going to be a desert of rubble and bodies for what's left. Either alternative is not pleasant to think about. So moving on to that next, what's possibly next, assuming that this withdrawal out of the Kherson region, is ultimately completed, and you have Russian forces back on the left bank of the Dnieper. We had talked about before, like the crossing that river, doing what we in the military call a wet gap crossing. That's really, really hard, especially if Russia has prepared defenses on the other side, which seems likely that they would be doing that to prevent, or at least make very costly Ukrainian crossing. And sort of my personal feeling on is like they would not want to do that. The Ukrainian military would not want to do a forced river crossing against a well prepared position. That's borderline suicidal. And to kind of echo what I think President Zelensky had said in his video last night when the news first came out, was like, we're trying to preserve every life that we can. So I see it very unlikely that they're going to try and do a forced river crossing. That said, what other possible axes of advance might we start looking at now, if and when the Russian withdrawal from Kherson is complete?
So sure. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians are continuing their offensives, obviously like less dramatic than it was a couple months ago, because obviously the less territory that Russia and its proxies in DNR, LNR have, the easier it is to defend, like in that regard. We can also observe on the latest war maps that the Ukrainians are less than 100 kilometers from Mariupol, a bit further away from Melitopol, but those are two of the cities on the coastline of the Sea of Azov that are basically in between Donbass and basically the Kherson, Crimea region in the south. And so it could very well be that perhaps what the Ukrainians are thinking is, one, we've had a lot of success, not by attacking Russia directly. And in fact, there was a brief period in the war where Russia's greatest success was by fighting according to its doctrine of, heavy artillery and then send the infantry in on relatively small areas of land. Ukraine has had its success by going after the supply routes into basically Russian positions. We can imagine that given the closer they're going to get to the Dnieper River, the closer they're going to get to Kherson City, their artillery range, their fires range, is going to basically cover everything between Kherson and Crimea. So probably in that direction, that's what they'll be going after, basically going forward. Any sort of railroad depot, ammunitions depot, anything that is relatively fixed or not terribly mobile, that's what they'll go after in order to make the supply of even those troops on the left bank of the river that much more difficult. We might also see, given sort of Russian strength in LNR, DNR, is that the next place that the Ukrainians go to is basically into that center region, meaning towards Melitopol, towards Mariupol, cutting the land bridge that Russia's been able to achieve over the course of the war that encircles the Sea of Azov. If they can cut that in half, that means that Russia will not be able to supply by land, truck, railway, etc., basically everything to the east of Kherson and Crimea itself. And that would be a major victory for the Ukrainians, because at that point, the writing would be on the wall in a way that that's not true now. Because, we talked about, General Milley said more than 6 figures of casualties on both sides. And just to think, like on the Russian side, between COVID, casualties, immigration, who knows how many millions is this demographic hole going to cause over like basically the years of late Putin. But nevertheless, Russian casualty figures are going to increase because the people going into the fight now are people who are not prepared and not well suited, who are going to be at best poorly trained and at best very poorly equipped. So obviously Putin is willing to use as many bodies as necessary in order to slow the Ukrainian advances. But what is going to indicate that on a strategic level, the war is lost? Kherson is not it, as embarrassing as it is, but perhaps losing Mariupol and Melitopol, which then suggests Crimea truly is in play, that might shape Russian strategy going forward.
Yeah, so I'm sure that as the first thing to watch is going to be what shape, if any, the withdrawal from the Kherson region actually takes, and then depending on how long it takes to unfold, we're going to be getting into the depths of winter here fairly shortly, and that's going to have some sort of play on what other possible axes of advance might be there. Although again, looking on some of the reactions to the news that came out yesterday on some of the military, or the analyst feeds I follow, there are, we may have talked about this before as well, there are reasons to potentially conduct a campaign in the winter months. It may not be the militarily the most easily, but there are potentially political reasons for Ukraine to try and attempt that, but and also there's military factors that cut both ways, right? Like it's going to be harder to move. Equipment suffers more in the cold. You have to be much more conscious of your own forces in terms of like cold weather gear and giving them the right food and the right shelter to make sure they don't suffer any health casualties basically from operating in the wintertime. But that goes for the Russians too. And as we talked about, I think it was a couple episodes ago, and then all the way back to one of the first ones, at their best, when the Russians were preparing for their thunder run down into Kyiv, and the withdrawal after, they were leaving behind bodies that had very poor winter equipment that showed signs of frostbite. So at their best, they were still not doing the basic force preservation stuff to take care of your people in the winter months. And as you just mentioned, like their people are not the best anymore. Their equipment losses have only increased over time. They could be an extremely vulnerable force just in the physical sense during the winter months, especially when they're not getting more cold weather clothing. On the flip side, we and other European nations that's specifically one of the items that's been going over there is cold weather clothing. And I mentioned, I think like the U.S. makes some very cozy cold weather clothing that keeps you in a good condition and ready to operate in cold temperatures. So yeah, again, something to watch, and especially see how the timing of the season aligns with the timeline of the withdrawal from Kherson and what time that leaves during the winter months for a possible, winter campaign down there near Mariupol. We can go for a bit, but I do want to sort of hit one of our bits that we often do here before we get to the end, which is the state of Russian media after the latest setback. And you described their response in a pretty stark term as they were discussing the news on all the talk shows.
So the energy was basically funeral type energy. There's always the people who said, as I was mentioning earlier, it may look like a humiliating abdication of Russian territory in a way that is reminiscent of the darkest days of our lowest points. But don't worry, the brightest days are ahead after the darkest storms. So, there's that energy that this is going to be a brilliantly executed tactical withdrawal in order to effect a far more devastating counterattack. So that's one part of the energy. The other part of the energy is really trying to understand, on these talk shows, who's at fault. You can't blame Putin because that's the only thing. So state capacity is starting to decline over Russia. One of the news items that I saw today is something that has a lot of 1990s just vibes is two groups of businessmen were coming from Kazakhstan in order to buy business in Russia outside the Domodedovo airport, which is a sort of one of Moscow's main airports. Both of their cars were attacked by gunmen, and they had $4 million in cash stolen from their cars. That indicates a level of organized criminality that hasn't been seen. That obviously, organized crime in Russia is very strong, but that level of public violence has not been seen in large part during the Putin years. So when we think about state capacity, we have to distinguish from regime capacity. If you go on TV and say Putin is a strategic genius because our 3-day special military operation is entering its ninth month, you will no longer be on TV as your best possible outcome. So the people on TV have to say, in essence, where was the failure of not anticipating that NATO would be even more devious than we previously thought? That in essence, who's at fault for not understanding just the cunning of the Ukrainians to manipulate basically the existing warmongers to join the fight against Russia? And on TV, they openly talk about these are the darkest days, basically since Russian Empire days. In the fall of the Russian Empire is what they're afraid of, is what they're observing right now. So people on Russian TV openly talk about empire, that this is an imperial war, that basically it's not NATO expansion that's causing them to be upset, but that NATO is helping one of their rebellious subjects of Ukraine stand up against Russia. That's their irritation. That's their anger. And so basically over the last couple of weeks and months, the mood has gotten really, really dark, specifically because the Russians are trying to figure out what's a face-saving way that still says Putin is the number one guy indefinitely. And it's hard for them. It truly is. You can see these people really working hard to try to find something positive for the future. And in fact, one of the guests last night, she was saying, the collapse of the Russian Empire wasn't so bad because it led to an even greater empire thereafter. And then the host said, "Are you insane? Losing the Russian Empire was terrible. We lost so many of our territories." And she said, and then another person said, "What? It wasn't that bad because the Soviet Union was so strong." And the host goes, "Well, what about Finland?" And the other guest says, "Well, we restored Finland to her independence." And the host then responds, so what you're telling me is that we should find the goodness in the Victorian exit from territories and people. And that's the point where they're basically they had to gently move in a different direction for the conversation. And again, that's essentially what you're talking about. What we're seeing on Russian TV is people upset that the imperialist war of choice is not going well, and trying to find ways to cope with that underlying fact of the Ukrainian narrative coming closer and closer to the reality that the Russians have to live in.
Yeah, I can understand that you got to spin it some way, and you don't really have an option not to try and spin it into something good. Although, I'm playing the smallest violin in the world for how hard they have to work to go do that. Okay, as always, we seem to really kind of maximize our time here, but there's pretty big development in the last 24 hours, so it's worth exploring, and something that it's really only just starting. And as we said, we don't even really know. We haven't sort of seen any signs of movement or a sense of what the scope of the withdrawal is going to look like. So definitely going to be a point to follow over here over the next week and see what actually happens. So Yuval, as always, good to talk to you, and appreciate you spending the time here with us for the rabbit hole and the broader Team Krulak broadcast community. We're actually brewing up a few things here along a few lines for you all to kind of look forward to. So on the broadcast line next week, we've got 2 episodes right now. We have Dan Rice, who is our new Russia subject matter expert here at the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University. So we're going to get him on for his inaugural episode and introduce you to the Team Krulak community and give you an idea of sort of the expertise he brings and get his assessment on some of the latest happenings since the National Party Congress recently and the implications of that. And then we're going to have Elena Wicker on to talk about what I'm personally very interested to learn more. She's done research into using artificial intelligence algorithms to analyze language inside of American national strategy documents and sort of identify trends and key things that maybe were not consciously manifested, but an AI analysis pulls out. Settling back to the down the rabbit hole side, we've got we're going to have a joint episode here at some point, maybe a couple on a few themes. One is looking at the supply of Iranian weapons that over the last few weeks they've been manifested on the Ukrainian battlefield. Like we've seen the suicide drones going into Kyiv and other cities causing damage. This came from Iran. There's been reports of Iranian military operators operating out close by with Russian forces to train and operate those things. And then there's also been discussion, I don't know if the weapons have moved yet, but about Iran supplying its own domestically made ballistic missiles to replace the stocks that Russia has used. So in an interesting sort of shift of weapons flow, Iran is becoming an arms supplier to support the Russian war effort rather than Russia being an exporter to some of these other countries. So we're going to look at bringing back Dr. Amin Tarzi and Dr. Anzalone, the MES team here with Yuval to take a look at that. And then in the deeper future, we're going to be working on, something nobody really wants to talk and think about, but it's out there, is the sort of broader implications of use of nuclear weapons. It's been discussed whether it's plausible or not, at least at this point in Ukraine, is from the Russian side is not certain, but the fact is they have those. What are the thoughts that would go into their employment there? What are the implications for China and other countries that either have nuclear weapons or are trying to develop them, on a 21st century battlefield? So not going to be a necessarily a pleasant discussion, but it's one that's important and something we haven't really focused on yet. So that'll be here in the deep future. But until then, everyone enjoy the weekend. Again, there's those Marines out there. Happy birthday. Stay safe. Be smart. But make sure you enjoy the time. You've all learned it. And we will look to see you all here on the next episode here. It'll be quite soon. So we'll be back with you here very quickly.